September 19th, 1998, Atchafalaya Basin, Louisiana, 23 miles southwest of Morgan City, deep in a part of the swamp where the cypress trees grow so thick that sunlight barely reaches the water even at noon. I'm telling you this because I'm retired now, and because the nightmares haven't stopped in 26 years. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there, and what we found in that swamp wasn't supposed to exist. We were a 6-man SEAL Team 3 element, tasked with what command called a routine interdiction operation. Intelligence had flagged a drug trafficking route running through the basin, Colombian product coming up through the Gulf, being staged in the deep swamp before distribution north. Simple enough. We'd done a dozen similar operations in Central America. The briefing at Little Creek lasted 20 minutes. In and out, 72 hours maximum. Observe, document, report. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. We were ghosts. That's what SEALs do. Our team leader was Lieutenant Marcus Hendricks, a Virginia native with 3 combat deployments under his belt. Calm, methodical, the kind of officer who double-checked everything but never micromanaged. He'd been in Panama during Just Cause, seen real action. I was the senior enlisted, a first-class petty officer from Minnesota who'd spent most of my career in cold water operations. The swamp heat was going to be a change, but I'd trained in worse. My specialty was communications. I carried the ANPRC-148, our lifeline to the outside world. Ramirez was our corpsman, a kid from Texas with steady hands and a dark sense of humor that kept morale up during long operations. Chen was point man, half Chinese, half Irish from San Francisco, with an almost supernatural ability to read terrain. Johnson handled the heavy weapons, a massive African-American from Georgia who could hump a MK-48 through hell without complaint. And then there was Kowalski, our tracker, a Polish-American from Chicago whose grandfather had fought at Monte Cassino. 6 of us, brothers. We inserted at 0200 hours from a rigid hull inflatable boat, killing the engine a mile out and paddling the rest of the way in. The water was black glass, reflecting nothing. The air was thick, not just humid but heavy, like breathing through wet wool. Standard loadout, M4A1 carbines with NPEQ-2 infrared target pointers. MK-11 sniper rifle for Hendricks, the MK-48 for Johnson. NVGs, of course. AN-PVS-14s mounted on our helmets. Each of us carried 72 hours of rations, water purification tablets, and enough ammunition for a small war. We weren't expecting to need any of it. The plan was simple. Establish a hide site, 3 clicks inland, observe the suspected staging area, gather intel, and extract. We'd done this 100 times in training, a dozen times for real. This should have been routine. The first sign that something was wrong came within an hour of insertion. Kowalski was on point, moving through the shallow water with Chen right behind him. I was third in the column, and I watched as Kowalski stopped suddenly, raised his fist in the universal signal to freeze. He pulled out his compass, studied it under red light, then tapped it twice against his palm like it was malfunctioning. Chen moved up beside him, and I could hear their whispered conversation through my earpiece. "Compass is spinning," Kowalski said. "Just spinning. Won't hold north." Chen checked his own compass. Same result. Hendricks moved forward, and we all gathered in a tight circle, waist-deep in murky water. Every compass was affected. The needles spun lazily, as if north had ceased to exist. "Magnetic anomaly," Hendricks said quietly. "There's iron deposits in swamps, deposits from meteors sometimes. Throws off compasses." It made sense. We'd been briefed on navigational challenges in the basin, but something about the way he said it told me he didn't quite believe his own explanation. Still, we were SEALs. We adapted. We switched to GPS navigation and kept moving. We reached our designated hide site at 0430 hours, just as the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the canopy. It was a raised area of relatively dry ground, surrounded by standing water and protected by a natural screen of saw palmetto and cypress knees. We established a perimeter, set up camouflage netting, and began the tedious work of settling in for what we expected to be days of observation. Johnson took first watch while the rest of us tried to get some rest in the oppressive heat. I couldn't sleep. The swamp should have been alive with sound, frogs, insects, birds waking up to greet the dawn. Instead, there was silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but an absolute, suffocating absence of sound. Like the world was holding its breath. "You feel that," Ramirez whispered from beside me. He was staring up at the canopy, his eyes moving back and forth like he was tracking something I couldn't see. "Feel what?" "Pressure. In my chest. Like when you dive too deep too fast, but we're at sea level." I focused and realized he was right. There was a sensation, subtle but present, like a low-frequency vibration just below the threshold of hearing. It made my teeth ache. "Infrasound," I said, more to convince myself than him. "Natural phenomenon. Tiger balm effect. Makes you uneasy, but it's harmless." But I'd experienced infrasound before, in submarine exercises. This was different. This felt directed. The first day passed without incident, if you could call that oppressive atmosphere and unnatural silence without incident. We observed the target area, a small island of raised ground about 500 meters from our position. There was evidence of recent activity, tire tracks in the mud, cigarette butts, a tarp strung between trees. But no people. Hendricks reported in at the scheduled time, 1800 hours. The transmission was clean, no issues. Command acknowledged, told us to continue the mission. Everything by the book. Night fell like a curtain. One moment there was twilight, the next, absolute darkness. We rotated watch, 2 men at a time, using the NVGs to scan our perimeter. The night vision turned the swamp into a green-tinted otherworld, all shadows and reflections. At 2300 hours during my watch with Chen, we heard it for the first time. A sound that didn't belong. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but it didn't fade. It grew slowly, a resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The water around us began to ripple, perfect concentric circles spreading out from multiple points, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. Chen had his weapon up, scanning through his NVG. "You seeing this?" he whispered. I was. In the green glow of night vision, the water was alive with movement. Not fish, not alligators, something else. Shapes that were almost human in proportion, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Too tall, moving with an undulating motion that suggested boneless flexibility. "Wake everyone up," I said quietly. "Do it slow." Within 30 seconds, all 6 of us were alert, weapons oriented outward in a defensive circle. The shapes in the water had stopped moving. They were just there, motionless. At least 7 of them that I could count, positioned at irregular intervals around our hide site. "Range?" Hendricks asked. 30 meters, Kowalski answered. "Maybe less. They're in the water, standing." Standing. That was the word that made my blood run cold. Whatever these things were, they were standing upright in water that should have been over their heads, unless they were 10 feet tall. "Thermal," Hendricks ordered. Johnson pulled out the ANPAS-28 thermal scope and swept our perimeter. He was silent for a long moment then. "Boss, you're going to want to see this." Hendricks took the scope, and I watched his posture change. His shoulders tightened, and when he lowered the scope, his face was ashen even in the green glow of the NVGs. "They're cold," he said. "Colder than the water. That's not possible. Nothing living is colder than its environment unless it's—" He didn't finish the sentence. We all knew what he meant. Dead, or something that shouldn't be alive in the first place. For 20 minutes, we maintained our defensive position. The shapes didn't move. They just stood there, in a loose circle around us, like they were waiting for something. My finger never left the trigger guard of my M4, but I didn't move it to the trigger. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and starting a firefight with unknown hostiles in the middle of a swamp seemed like a good way to die. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The shapes in the water moved all at once, sliding away into the darkness with that same boneless motion. Within seconds, they were gone. "What the fuck was that?" Johnson said, his voice barely controlled. Nobody had an answer. Hendricks tried to raise command on the SATCOM, but got nothing but static. The ANPRC 148 showed full bars, should have had clear line of sight to the satellite, but every frequency was corrupted with white noise. "Try again at dawn," Hendricks decided. "We maintain position. Everyone stays alert. I want 100% security until sunrise." The rest of the night was the longest of my life. We took watch in pairs, 30-minute rotations to keep everyone fresh. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, that something just beyond the range of our vision was studying us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. At 05:30 hours, as dawn light began filtering through the canopy, Kowalski discovered the tracks. He'd moved 10 meters from our position to check something, and when he called us over, his voice had a tremor I'd never heard before. Kowalski was the calmest guy I knew, the one who never rattled. But now he was rattled. The tracks were in the mud at the water's edge. Footprints, if you could call them that. They were roughly humanoid. A heel, an arch, 5 toes. But they were massive, at least 18 inches long and proportionately wide. And the depth of the impression suggested something extraordinarily heavy. "Whatever made these weighs 500-600 pounds minimum," Kowalski said, kneeling beside the prints. "But look at the spacing. The stride length it's not possible. Nothing with this weight distribution should be able to move this efficiently through mud." The tracks circled our position completely, a perfect ring about 25 meters out. And at irregular intervals there were marks in the mud that looked almost like something had been kneeling, pressing down into the earth as if observing us from a prone position. "They were watching us," Chen said. It wasn't a question. Hendricks made the call. "We're pulling back to the secondary extraction point. This mission is compromised. Pack it up, we move in 5. The relief I felt was palpable. We weren't running, we were tactically withdrawing. There's a difference. SEALs withdraw when the mission parameters change, when the risk assessment shifts. This wasn't cowardice. This was survival. We broke down the hide site, policed our brass, erased every sign we'd been there. Then we formed up in a tactical column and began moving northeast, toward the extraction coordinates 4 clicks away. The swamp fought us every step. The water seemed deeper than it should have been, the mud more clutching. Cypress roots caught at our boots, and the saw palmetto cut through our uniforms despite the thick fabric. It was like the environment itself wanted to slow us down, to keep us there. We'd covered maybe a click when the smell hit us. It was a combination of rot and sulfur, with an underlying sweetness like overripe fruit. Strong enough to taste, thick enough to make Ramirez gag. We'd all smelled death before, human and animal, but this was different. This was older, more primal. "Gas pocket," Hendricks said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Methane from decomposition, common in swamps. Except methane doesn't smell sweet, and it doesn't make your eyes water the way this did." We pushed through it, trying to breathe through our mouths, and emerged into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. It was maybe 50 meters across, a perfect circle of dead vegetation. The trees at the edge leaned away from the center, their bark blackened as if by fire, though there was no sign of burning. In the middle of the clearing was a structure. I say structure because I don't know what else to call it. It was maybe 12 feet tall, roughly pyramidal, made from what looked like cypress wood and mud and something else, something white that glinted in the diffused sunlight. Bones, I realized. Animal bones, arranged in deliberate patterns, woven into the structure with vines and Spanish moss. "That's not on the map," Chen said quietly. "None of this is on the map," Hendricks replied. He pulled out the topographical chart, compared it to our GPS coordinates. According to both, we should have been in the middle of dense swamp forest. This clearing didn't exist on any survey. "Indigenous peoples," Kowalski offered. "Atacapa tribes used to inhabit this area. Could be an old ceremonial site." "The Atacapa were gone by the late 1800s, I said. "And that structure looks recent. Some of those bones still have tissue on them." Hendricks raised his fist, signaling a halt. We move around it, wide berth. Keep it in sight, but don't approach. Chen, stay on point. The rumbling started again, cutting him off. Louder this time, strong enough that I could feel it in my bones. The water around us began to churn, and from multiple points around the clearing's perimeter, those shapes emerged. They rose from the water like they were being lifted by invisible hands, and in the daylight I finally got a clear look at what we were dealing with. They were humanoid, yes, but only in the most basic sense. 8 to 10 feet tall, their proportions all wrong. Arms that hung too long, legs that bent at too many joints. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see the dark shapes of organs moving beneath it. No clothing, no visible genitals, nothing that indicated normal mammalian biology. But it was their faces that made my blood freeze. They had features, eyes, a mouth, something that might have been a nose. But they were fluid, shifting, as if their skull structure was made of something malleable. And their eyes, when they focused on us, glowed with a faint, blue-green bioluminescence. There were at least 15 of them now, emerging from the water in a slowly contracting circle around our position. They didn't make any sound, didn't show any obvious aggression, but the intent was clear. They were hurting us. They were... "Weapons free," Hendricks said, his voice steady despite the situation. "Controlled pairs. Aim for center mass. If they're biological, center mass will drop them." Johnson opened fire first, the MK-48 roaring in the confined space. I watched the tracers hit the nearest creature square in what should have been its chest. The impact made it stagger, but there was no blood, no apparent damage, just a slight indentation that filled back in like water settling after a stone is removed. "They're not solid!" Johnson shouted over the sound of his weapon. "Boss, they're not fucking solid!" We opened up, all of us. Controlled bursts aimed at the creatures advancing from multiple directions. The sound was deafening, the smell of cordite mixing with that sweet rot odor. Bullets passed through the creatures with visible effect. I could see the projectiles creating temporary cavities in their bodies, but they just kept coming. "Displacement," Hendricks ordered. "Move to the structure. It's defensible." It went against every instinct I had, but we were running out of options. We broke contact, firing and moving in a leapfrog pattern, and ran for the structure in the center of the clearing. Up close, it was worse than I'd thought. The bones weren't just woven into the structure. They were arranged in patterns that suggested language, or mathematics, or something that served both purposes. And the smell coming from inside the structure was overpowering, a combination of every bad thing I'd ever experienced. But there was an opening, low to the ground, and we went through it one by one, Johnson pulling rear security and hosing down the approaching creatures with the last of his belt-fed ammunition. Inside, it was dark and cool, the temperature at least 15 degrees lower than the ambient air outside. The interior was larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, a single chamber maybe 20 feet across, with walls that curved upward to a central point. And it wasn't empty. My NVG illuminated the space in green-tinted clarity. There were markings on the walls, carved deep into the cypress wood, the same patterns I'd seen in the bones. And hanging from the walls, suspended by vines, were objects. A machete, its blade pitted with rust. A canteen with U.S. Army markings from World War II. A compass with a brass case. A leather boot that was falling apart with age. And photographs, dozens of photographs, black and white and faded, showing men in various military uniforms. Men in locations that looked exactly like this swamp. "Jesus Christ," Ramirez whispered. "How long has this been going on?" One photograph caught my attention. It showed a man in what looked like a World War I-era uniform, standing in front of a structure that might have been an earlier version of this one. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Someone." Hendricks was examining the markings on the walls, running his fingers over the deep grooves. "This is a warning," he said. "These symbols, I've seen similar ones in Kurdistan. Villages that were marked as cursed, places the locals wouldn't go near." "Warning about what?" Chen asked. Before Hendricks could answer, the rumbling changed pitch. It was no longer coming from all around us. It was coming from below. The ground beneath our feet vibrated, and I could hear something large moving through water directly under the structure. "There's a basement," Kowalski said, pointing to a section of floor that was clearly different from the rest. It was wood planks, ancient and warped, but deliberately placed. And in the center of the planks was an iron ring, like a handle. "We're not opening that," Hendricks said flatly. "We might not have a choice, boss," Johnson said from his position at the entrance. "They're not coming in, but they're not leaving either. They're just waiting." I moved to the entrance and looked out. The creatures had formed a perfect circle around the structure, maybe 30 feet out. At least 20 of them now, all motionless, all facing us with those bioluminescent eyes. And beyond them, in the trees at the clearing's edge, I could see more shapes moving. Dozens more. We were surrounded, our ammunition was running low, and our extraction point was 3 clicks away. The SATCOM was still dead, giving us nothing but static. We were, by any tactical assessment, completely fucked. "We need to make a run for it," Chen said. "Break through their line and get to the extraction point. It's our only play." "They'll follow us," Kowalski said. "Whatever they are, they've been coordinating their movements. They're intelligent. They'll track us through the swamp and pick us off." "So what's your suggestion?" Chen snapped back. "We stay here and wait for them to decide what to do with us?" The argument was cut short by a sound from below the floor. We all froze. The voice came again, clearer this time, accompanied by what sounded like wet breathing. "Help us. Trapped. So long." Ramirez crossed himself, his face pale. "That's not possible. There's nobody down there. There can't be." But the voice continued, and now I could make out the individual sounds. It was definitely English, and it was definitely coming from beneath the floorboards. But there was something wrong with the rhythm, the cadence. It was like someone had learned English phonetically, without understanding what the words meant. "They're mimicking," Hendricks said. "Prey attraction. Deep-sea anglerfish do it, use bioluminescence to lure prey. These things might do the same with sound." "Or," Johnson said quietly, "maybe there really is someone down there." We looked at each other, and I could see the same calculation running through everyone's mind. If there were survivors down there, trapped by these creatures, we had a moral obligation to help. But if it was a trap, and everything in my gut said it was a trap, we'd be dooming ourselves. The decision was taken out of our hands when the floor gave way. It happened fast. One moment we were standing on solid wood, the next the entire section with the iron ring collapsed inward with a sound like breaking bones. Ramirez, who'd been standing closest to the center, went down with a scream that cut off abruptly when he hit whatever was below. "Ramirez!" Hendricks shouted, moving toward the hole. I grabbed him, pulled him back as the edges of the collapse continued to crumble. From below, we could hear splashing, thrashing, and then that voice again, except now it was coming from multiple sources, overlapping, creating a discordant chorus. "Help us, help us, help us, trapped, trapped, so long, help us, help." And then Ramirez screamed again, a sound of pure agony that raised every hair on my body. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before it was choked off, replaced by a wet, tearing sound. Johnson moved before I could stop him, dropping a chem light down the hole to illuminate whatever was down there. The green glow fell, bounced, rolled, and came to rest against something that made my mind rebel against what I was seeing. The space below wasn't a basement. It was a cavern, maybe 30 feet deep, filled with water that was moving with unnatural currents. And in that water were more of the creatures, dozens of them, but different. These were bloated, malformed, their translucent skin stretched tight over masses of tissue that pulsed with internal movement. And they were feeding on Ramirez, or what was left of him. I could see his legs, his torso, his arms, but they were separated, floating in different parts of the cavern as the creatures tore him apart with hands that suddenly had claws, mouths, that suddenly had teeth. "Fall back!" Hendricks roared. "Out, now!" We scrambled for the entrance, but the creatures outside had begun to move. They weren't waiting anymore. They were closing in, their movement accelerating, and I realized we'd been on their timetable all along. They'd herded us here, contained us, and now they were going to finish what they'd started. "Light them up!" Hendricks shouted, and we did, burning through our remaining ammunition in a desperate attempt to create an opening. The creatures closest to us went down, not dead, but disrupted enough that we could push through. Chen went first, then Kowalski, then Johnson. Hendricks grabbed my shoulder, pushed me forward. "Go, I'm right behind you." I went, stumbling over the uneven ground, my boots squelching in the mud. Behind me, I could hear Hendricks firing single shots, controlled and measured even in retreat. Then I heard him shout something, a warning, and a different sound, something massive moving through water. I turned back just in time to see the structure collapse inward, the entire pyramid-like construction falling into the cavern below with a sound like the world ending. And rising from the collapse, emerging from the churning water and splintered wood, was something that made the other creatures look insignificant. It was huge, maybe 30 feet tall, and it wasn't remotely humanoid. Its body was a mass of translucent tissue shot through with dark veins, constantly shifting and reforming. Multiple limbs extended from its central mass, not arms or legs, but tentacles or pseudopods that ended in structures that resembled hands. Mouths, eyes, all shifting and changing. And it made a sound, a keening wail that wasn't audio as much as it was pressure, a physical force that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. "Run!" someone was shouting. Might have been me, might have been all of us. We ran, crashing through the swamp with no attempt at stealth or tactical movement. The creatures were behind us, around us, and that massive thing was coming. I could feel it in the way the ground shook with each of its movements. Kowalski went down first. I didn't see what got him, just heard him cry out, and looked back to see him being dragged backward into the water by something I couldn't fully perceive. He got off 2 shots before he went under, and the water turned dark with something that wasn't quite blood. We didn't stop, couldn't stop. Johnson was beside me, his face set in a rictus of determination, the empty MK-48 discarded, now carrying just his sidearm. Chen was ahead, somehow still navigating, finding the least treacherous path through the swamp. Behind us, the sound of that thing moving was getting closer. Trees were crashing down, water was churning, and that pressure sound was building to an intensity that made my nose bleed. "There!" Chen shouted, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could see open water. The extraction point. If we could just reach it, if the boat was there, if command had received our distress call, if. So many ifs between us and survival. We broke out of the tree line onto a muddy bank where, by some miracle, our RHIB was waiting. The engine was running, and I could see 2 figures in tactical gear waving us in. Chen dove into the boat first, then Johnson. Hendricks came out of the trees, his uniform torn, his face bleeding from a dozen cuts. He practically threw me into the boat, then grabbed the side to pull himself in. That's when something grabbed him. It was one of the tall, pale creatures, but this one was different, older maybe, or more developed. Its skin had patterns on it, bioluminescent markings that resembled the symbols on the structure's walls. It had wrapped around Hendrix's leg with an arm that seemed to have too many joints, and it was pulling him back toward the water with impossible strength. I grabbed Hendrix's vest, dug my boots into the boat's side, and pulled. Johnson joined me, and we heaved with everything we had. For a moment, it was a stalemate. We couldn't pull Hendrix in, but the creature couldn't pull him out. Then Hendrix made the decision for us. He looked me in the eye, and I saw acceptance there. Understanding. He'd been a SEAL for 15 years. He knew the score. "Tell them," he said. Then he pulled his K-bar knife from his belt and brought it down hard on the creature's arm. The blade passed through the translucent flesh like it was cutting fog, but it was enough to break the thing's grip. We hauled Hendrix into the boat, the pilot gunned the engine, and we shot out across the open water, as that massive thing emerged from the tree line behind us. In the light of early morning, I got my only clear look at it, and I wish to God I hadn't. It was awareness. That's the only way I can describe it. Not just a creature, but consciousness made manifest, ancient and alien and absolutely hostile to everything human. Its surface roiled with faces that formed and dissolved, mouths that opened and closed, eyes that looked in every direction at once. And it didn't pursue us. It just stood at the water's edge, watching as we fled, and I had the terrible certainty that it could have caught us if it wanted to, that it was choosing to let us go, the way a cat sometimes lets a mouse escape just to enjoy the hunt more next time. The ride back to the forward operating base at the Naval Support Activity Base in New Orleans took 40 minutes. None of us spoke. What could we say? We'd lost 3 men to something that couldn't exist, in a swamp that supposedly contained nothing more dangerous than alligators and water moccasins. When we arrived, we were separated immediately. I never saw Chen or Johnson again after that day. They put us in individual rooms. Medical isolation, they called it. But the guards outside the door told a different story. The debriefs started 6 hours later. Not Navy brass, not even JSOC. These were civilian contractors, with Department of Defense credentials that checked out but felt wrong. They asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? How many creatures? What happened to Lieutenant Hendricks? What happened to the others? I told them everything at first. Then I realized they already knew. They'd known before we went in. The questions weren't about gathering information. They were about determining what we knew, what we'd seen, what we could prove. On the 3rd day, they brought in the NDAs, non-disclosure agreements backed by federal law, with language that made it clear discussing any aspect of Operation Blackwater could result in court-martial, imprisonment, and prosecution under the Espionage Act. They told me the official story. The mission had been compromised by drug traffickers, 3 casualties in a firefight. Our team had performed admirably but had been outgunned. I was being awarded a Purple Heart for wounds I didn't remember receiving, and a recommendation for valor that would go in a file I'd never be allowed to read. Sign the NDA, the lead contractor said. His name was Thompson, or that's what his badge said. Sign it, take your discharge, and go live your life. You've served your country well. This is your chance to go home. And if I don't sign? I asked. Thompson's expression didn't change. Then we'll keep you in isolation until we're satisfied you understand the gravity of the situation. Some people spend years coming to that understanding, but they all sign eventually. I signed. So did Chen and Johnson, I assume, wherever they were. The official record says Operation Blackwater never existed. The 3 men we lost, Ramirez, Kowalski, Hendricks, they're listed as training accidents. Vehicle crashes, mundane deaths that don't raise questions. Their families got closed casket funerals and flags and the gratitude of a nation that would never know what their sons, husbands, and fathers had really died fighting. I was given a psychiatric discharge, a medical pension, and a prescription for sleeping pills that barely touched the nightmares. They set me up with a house in Minnesota, far from any large body of water, and for 26 years I've kept my mouth shut about what happened in that swamp. But I'm old now, retired from a second career that never felt real after what I saw. The NDAs have no power over a dead man, and I've got stage 4 cancer. 6 months, they tell me, maybe less. So I'm telling this story now, while I still can, because people deserve to know what's out there, because those 3 men deserve to be remembered for what they really faced, and because I've been doing research in the years since, looking at old records, newspaper archives, military databases from before everything was digital, and I've found things, reports of disappearances in the Atchafalaya Basin going back to the 1700s, Native American legends about the Pale Ones who lived deep in the swamp, Civil War records that mention a Confederate patrol that went into the basin and never came out, accounts from World War II of a training exercise that lost 11 men to equipment failure. There's a pattern. Every few decades, the military sends people into that swamp, sometimes for legitimate reasons, training, interdiction, reconnaissance. Sometimes I think, just to see if whatever's down there is still active. And it is. It's always active. It's always waiting. Because I keep track of the news from Louisiana, and every year there are reports. Fishermen who disappear, hunters who never come home, boats found drifting with no one aboard. The structure I saw, the one that collapsed, I found references to similar constructions in old reports. They call them marker sites in the classified documents I wasn't supposed to see but managed to access through a friend who still has clearance. Warnings, quarantine indicators, signs that say, in every language that matters, don't go here, don't wake what sleeps. But people do go there. We did. And we woke something. I don't know if it was contained by that collapse, or if it's still out there, waiting in the deep water and the thick mud. What I do know is that Hendricks made it back to the boat. He was alive when we extracted. But 3 days into the debriefs, they told me he'd died from his injuries. Said it was internal bleeding, complications from the extraction. I didn't believe them then. I don't believe them now. I think Hendricks knew too much, saw too much, and more importantly, I think he refused to sign. Marcus Hendricks was a lot of things, but he wasn't the kind of man who'd let truth die in the dark. So they made him die instead. Sometimes, late at night when the sleeping pills aren't working, I wonder if any of us really made it out. If maybe we're all still there, in that swamp, going through our extraction while those things watch and study and learn. Because that's what they were doing. Not hunting us like animals, studying us, learning how we move, how we communicate, how we think, getting ready for something. The last time I had contact with Chen was 5 years ago, a single email from an anonymous account. 3 words, they're still there. I knew what he meant. Whatever we encountered in September of 1998, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still in the Atchafalaya Basin, still in the deep water where the cypress trees grow too thick for sunlight to penetrate. Still waiting. And the government knows. They've always known. Those structures, those marker sites, they didn't appear naturally. Someone built them long ago, as warnings or containment or both. Someone encountered these things before the United States even existed, and they left signs for those who came after. Stay away. Don't disturb. Let sleeping things lie. But we don't listen, do we? We're human. We push boundaries. We explore. We conquer. And sometimes we wake things that should stay sleeping. I dream about it still. That massive thing rising from the collapsed structure, its body a shifting mass of awareness and hunger. And in my dreams, it speaks. Not in English, not in any human language. But I understand it anyway. It's thanking us. Thanking us for coming, for feeding it, for reminding it that the world above still exists. For all those years it was contained, trapped by symbols and structures, and the will of people long dead. But containment requires maintenance. And who maintains warnings that have been forgotten? We broke the seal, literally and figuratively. And something that had been barely contained is now loose, growing stronger with each person who wanders into its territory, each fisherman who doesn't come home, each hunter whose boat is found empty. The military still patrols those waters. I know they do, because I still have contacts, people who tell me things they shouldn't. They go in heavy now, full tactical teams with air support and equipment that didn't exist in 1998. And they still lose people, because you can't kill something that isn't entirely physical. You can't bomb something that exists partially outside normal space. And you can't fight something that's been waiting for millennia, something that's learned patience as an art form. All you can do is mark the boundaries, keep people away, and hope that containment holds for another generation. I'm telling you this because I'm dying, and because the truth matters more than the national security implications. People have a right to know what's lurking in those swamps. Parents have a right to know why they should keep their kids away from certain areas, why some fishing spots should stay off limits, why some stretches of water are marked as navigation hazards for reasons that have nothing to do with shallow water or debris. If you take nothing else from this account, take this. There are places on this earth that belong to older things than us. Places that were claimed before humans existed by entities that view us the way we view bacteria, as resources, as curiosities, as things to be consumed or studied as the mood takes them. The Atchafalaya Basin is one of those places, and it's not the only one. I've spent 26 years researching, compiling reports, connecting dots that the government has tried very hard to keep separated. There are sites like this all over the world. The Bermuda Triangle isn't a mystery, it's a quarantine zone. The Devil's Sea off Japan, the Michigan Triangle, the Bennington Triangle in Vermont, all marked, all monitored, all containing things that official science says don't exist. But they do exist. We know they do. The men and women who go into these places and don't come back, they know. The families who lose loved ones to equipment failures and navigational errors, they suspect. And the government agencies that maintain the cover-up, they know better than anyone. Because they're the ones who have to go in and clean up when containment fails. They're the ones who see the aftermath, who process the bodies when there are bodies to process, and who write the reports that get buried in classified archives. I've left documents, everything I've compiled over the years, every scrap of evidence I could find, every testimony from people like me who survived these encounters. I've left them with people I trust, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me before natural causes take me. Maybe it won't matter. Maybe the story will be dismissed as the ravings of a dying man, drug-induced hallucinations from too much morphine and not enough rational thought. Maybe the government will successfully suppress it, the way they've suppressed everything else. But maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Someone will take it seriously. Someone will demand answers about why so many people vanish in these places, why so much military activity happens in areas that are supposedly just wilderness. Because the truth is out there, in every sense of that phrase. It's in the Atchafalaya Basin, it's in the deep water and the thick mud, it's in the structures that mark ancient boundaries, in the warnings that have been forgotten, in the containment systems that are failing, and it's getting stronger. I can feel it. The way you can feel a storm coming even before the sky darkens. Whatever we encountered in 1998 is growing, evolving, adapting. It's learning from every encounter, every failed containment operation, every team that goes in and doesn't come out. The question isn't whether it will break free completely. The question is when, and what happens to the rest of us when it does. I think about Ramirez sometimes, about how he looked when he went through that floor. The surprise on his face. He was a good kid, barely 25, with a fiancée waiting for him back in Texas. She got a letter saying he died in a training accident. She got a flag and a pension and lies. I think about Kowalski, being dragged backward into the water, knowing exactly what was happening but unable to stop it. He had kids, 2 daughters. They're grown now, probably with kids of their own. They think their grandfather was a hero who died serving his country. They're right, but not in the way they think. And Hendricks, Marcus Hendricks, who made the decision to let us pull him into that boat instead of going quietly into the water, who died, was killed 3 days later because he wouldn't stay silent. They deserved better than to be forgotten, to have their deaths attributed to mundane causes. They deserved to have their story told, their sacrifice recognized. So I'm telling it, for them, for the families who never knew the truth, for the people who will come after, who might wander into these places without understanding what they're walking into. The sleeping pills don't work anymore. Nothing works. I see them every time I close my eyes, those pale shapes rising from the water, that massive thing emerging from the collapsed structure, those bioluminescent eyes studying us, with an intelligence that preceded human civilization by millennia. And sometimes, in that space between waking and sleeping, I hear it. That voice that isn't quite a voice, that pressure sound that resonates in your bones. It's calling, reaching out across the miles and the years. Come back, come home, come back to the water. But I won't. I'll die here in Minnesota, as far from large bodies of water as I could get. I'll die knowing that I told the truth finally, after 26 years of silence. And I'll die hoping that someone, somewhere, takes this warning seriously. Because the alternative, the possibility that these things might spread beyond their containment zones, might emerge from the deep places where they've been sleeping. That keeps me awake more than the nightmares. We're not the apex predators we think we are. We're not even close. We're just lucky that the things that actually hold that position have mostly stayed in their territories, contained by warnings and symbols and structures that we barely understand. But luck runs out. Containment fails. And when it does, we'll find out what it really means to be at the bottom of the food chain, facing something that views us as we view cattle, resources to be harvested when the time is right. Operation Blackwater ended officially in September 1998. But the truth is, it never ended. It's still ongoing, playing out in classified briefings and sealed reports, and families being told lies about how their loved ones died. And in the Atchafalaya Basin, in the deep water where the cypress trees grow too thick for sunlight, something waits, patient, eternal, growing stronger with each person who ignores the warnings, with each boundary that's crossed, with each containment that fails. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is the truth that cost 3 good men their lives and cost me 26 years of nightmares. Stay away from the deep places. Stay away from the waters that are marked as hazards. And if you see structures made of wood and bone, marked with symbols you don't understand, don't approach. Don't investigate. Don't disturb. Because some things should stay buried. Some things should stay sleeping. And some truths, as much as it pains me to say it, should maybe stay hidden. But it's too late for that now. I've told the story, and whatever happens next, that's not on me anymore.